Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Hi, I'm Roberto Mazza, the host of Jerusalem Unplugged. In this podcast, we will not only explore the fascinating history, politics, society, and incredible people of Jerusalem, but also unravel how this city plays a significant role on the global stage. Join me in uncovering the multifaceted stories that make Jerusalem not just a local gem, but a force that resonates worldwide. Today, my guest is Refqa Abu Remaile. Refqa is the author of Country of Words, a Transnational Atlas for Palestinian Literature, a fascinating project, not a book, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2023 and is fully available and freely available online at countryofwords.org. Country of Words is a digital-born project that retraces and remaps the global story of Palestinian literature in the 20th century, starting from the Arab world and going through Europe, North America, and Latin America. The virtual realm acts as the meeting place for the data and narrative fragments of this literature in motion, bringing together porous, interrupted, disconnected, and discontinuous fragments into an elastic, interconnected, and entangled literary history. But before we delve into all of this, first things first, Refqa, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. It's nice to be with you.
So you have an amazing project. And as I said in the introduction, first of all, this is not a traditional book, but it's a website. And I will repeat the link many times. And obviously, I will post the link on the podcast notes, countryofwords.org. But first, I want to ask you about yourself. So if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your careers, and also about the origins of this project.
Sure. I'm a scholar of Palestinian literature and film, as a specialization of working on modern Arabic literature and film. And I would say this project was a gradual build-up from my previous work. I didn't really know that I was coming to this point, but I think different pieces that I worked on, researched, and wrote led me to this publication, Country of Words. Maybe I'll just mention a few of them, one of which was this piece that I published in the Journal of Palestine Studies called The Three Enigmas of Palestinian Literature. And here it was my first attempt at stepping back from a literary analysis, let's say, of specific authors or periods, to start and see the bigger picture, or to try and see the bigger picture of Palestinian literature. And in this article, I posed three questions. The questions were, who gets to write Palestinian literature? Who gets to write the Palestinian story? Is it somebody inside in Palestine, or somebody in the diaspora? Or is it all these places at once? And the other question was, how do we address this silence and non-linearity that is at the heart of the story of Palestinian literature? And then the third question was that, given we were dealing with a national literature without a nation state, how did we contend with issues of fragmentation and wholeness, or the striving towards wholeness? So these questions really set me on a path that made me realize that the tools and methods and the ways we have studied Palestinian literature are not enough to tell us the bigger story. And that a lot of scholarship on Palestinian literature either focused on a specific author or a set of authors on a certain period, a certain geography, but never everything all at once. So then I started thinking, how can we shift things around so we can start to see Palestine in its, let's say, bigger extended geography, which includes the homeland and the diaspora. And in a piece which was published in the Journal of Arabic Literature, I started thinking about Palestinian literature in what I called the digital age of the refugee. And here I started thinking about the refugee and the exile as figures that I believed haunt Palestinian literature, that they're haunting it because they've never been acknowledged as being central to this history, and because they have been there throughout this entire history. So I asked myself, what happens if we make the refugee and the exile the center of the story? How does this help us overcome or see maybe, or even embrace a story that is unconventional, fragmented, scattered, and extranational, that goes beyond the borders of the nation state, but goes beyond what we are normally trained in, which is usually along the lines of methodological nationalism. And I also started to think about the digital sphere. That's where it started. I was paying attention to digital projects that were coming out. And I started to think, could the digital sphere be this realm that could house and express and visualize all the different fragments of the story and to bring them together? And then a third piece I wanted to highlight, which was on this idea of the novel as contrapuntal reading. This piece focused on Ilyas Khouri's novel Children of the Ghetto, My Name is Adam, but actually it had wider implications on this project. I'm only realizing this now. Of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but basically I started thinking of counterpoint and contrapuntal reading in the way that Edward Said, in his book On Late Style, which I think not many people pay attention to this book because it's about music essentially, but he establishes a very useful methodology and frame of this contrapuntal reading, which I saw as very conducive to tackling fragmented and parallel and overlapping histories. I can talk about this a little bit more later, but this piece also helped me envision the digital space as also a space where harmonious and dissonant fragments can meet and come together to be read together. And of course, this then led to the PalRead project, which was a project funded by the European Research Council. This was a 5-year project, and I have to stress that it was a group, a collaborative, team-based project, which is very different from the ways we work normally in the humanities, but it allowed us to really work hard to gather sources from all over the world that then made the writing of this project, Country of Words, a Transnational Atlas for Palestinian Literature, possible. And then in the Transnational Atlas, I mentioned specifically 3 Palestinian scholars that really guided my work, because I felt that I was following in their footsteps and building on their footsteps, which were Hanna Abu Hanna, Salma Khadra Jayusi, and of course Edward Said. And here I just wanted to highlight that the first 2 are often, Hanna Abu Hanna, for most people in the Western kind of scholarship world, would not really know his work, but I really wanted to stress and highlight his work because he is so essential to this journey and my journey in searching for Palestinian heritage, as he called, this is the title of one of his books. Salma Khadra Jayusi, was very late acknowledged and recognized for all her amazing efforts in the field of literature. And Edward Said, of course, is internationally known, but I wanted to highlight those other 2 scholars which have really guided and influenced my process.
You spoke about digital humanities and the digital nature of your project. So I must ask, why did you choose an online outlet instead of a traditional book? Because, when I think about Stanford University Press, I think about paper and pages to turn. And when I think about literature, it's even, I feel like a deeper connection to, the idea of the old style book. Perhaps I'm, an historian and suffering from nostalgia of having all of these books around instead of a digital version of the books. But I'm curious about why choosing a digital outlet.
Yes, this is really important and was a challenging decision for me to make because, of course, I want a book to hold in my hands and I value books as material objects. But the purpose of this, which was there was a small window for me to experiment with digital humanities in ways I don't know if I will be able to do in the future because the Stanford University Press digital projects arm didn't have, it's not a permanent, let's say, aspect of the publishing house. So there was only a small window where I could attempt to make this contribution. And I wanted to really come up with something that offered different entry points for the user. So you have different views that through which you can enter this project. So you have a timeline view, you have a network view, you have a visualizations gallery, and you have audio interviews, all of which you can enter at, you can just make a decision to enter wherever you like. This is an idea that I thought is appealing for, trying to answer these questions of how do you deal with non-linear, decentralized literary history. I also wanted to be able to connect periods to each other through a process of highlighting important people, periodicals, and themes, which I did in the text of each of the chapters, which are the periods. And I wanted a way to incorporate oral history as audio, but also as part of the text, to refer to the audio, for people to be able to listen to the audio, but also to see how it fits into the story. And what's a way to bring all of this in a kind of dynamic fashion and interactive way that frankly, a conventional book would not be able to do. And I wanted to create a resource more than anything that people can come back to time and time again. Students, teachers can use it. It's easy to assign. It's not something anybody has to buy or there's no paywalls. I wanted it to be open access and freely available as a resource for the wider community and any interested individual in this. So I didn't want it to face the same hurdles that academic publications face, that they are not widely disseminated. So this was very important to me as a contribution to the history of Palestinian literature. And maybe conceptually here, I can say a little bit more about this contrapuntal approach, let's say. I wanted to find a mode of representation that could capture this overlapping and what I saw as simultaneous fragments of the story. Again, it's very hard to do this in a conventional book. Something that is elastic and maybe also open-ended, because realizing, and working on this project made me realize that it will never be comprehensive. It will never be complete. So a form that is forgiving of these gaps, let's say, and losses and silences in the sources and in the story. And I wanted a way to read together the national and the exilic. So here I tried to find, a way, how can I do a contrapuntal reading of Palestinian literary history? Said, in his book on late style, he talks about Bach and Bach's fugues and the invention at the heart of counterpoint. He also talks about Glenn Gould, who's the Canadian pianist who interprets and reads Bach's counterpoint. So I took that and I wanted to expand this framework that Said talks about in the context of music and music interpretation, and to take it somewhere else that was more relevant to Palestinian literature. And in the piece I mentioned earlier about Ilyas Khouri's novel, I suggested that Ilyas Khouri wrote a narrative that is a contrapuntal of Palestinian literature. So what I wanted to do is extend this framework even further and offer this reading of Palestinian literary history in a contrapuntal fashion. And maybe I can just say that I tried. I don't know if it was successful, but the timeline view with the timeline at the top of that page, I can see as a very, very simplified version of maybe contrapuntal notation, let's say, because of the overlapping periods of diasporas and occupation in the homeland. So yeah, in the digital, I found this possibility to try and capture these things, to try and experiment with these things. I think this is just a beginning. Of course, other people can do other things, but and it's a developing area where we can hopefully have more access to, let's say, technologies and software that is adaptable to what they call right to left languages like Arabic, which are at a disadvantage right now. So there's only so much we can do. But this was the idea, to really experiment with these fragments coming together in a contrapuntal manner.
I must say that one of my favorite sections, and a very hard one to put in a regular book, it's visualization, this idea to show through maps, networks, again, timelines that you mentioned, but also temporal evolutions and trajectories, how Palestinian literature developed, expanded, and all of the transnational connection. And it's a fascinating section. The amount of time that I spent just browsing and found all of these amazing lines of connection. And I agree with you, that would have been very hard, almost impossible probably, to put in a regular book. So before we go into the various parts of Country of Words, the general feeling browsing and reading the various articles is that Palestinian literature is in danger.
Yes, absolutely. This is something that maybe shocked me to realize eventually just how in danger it has been for the last 100 years or so. I mean, the book traces this kind of history of erasure and annihilation attempts and successes in some cases. It also shows consistent policies to stop, to stunt, to suspend, to prevent, and wipe off the map Palestinian presence, culture, history, identity. Even the Arabic language is at risk here in this kind of context. And there's also persistent efforts to devastate, destroy, I would say deculture, decivilize in a way. I mean, what we are seeing now at very intense levels that we have not seen before. I would say these have been at play throughout the 20th century until today. And the transition from period to period, this was the most difficult part for me because this was not at all smooth. Almost every single transition involved the wiping out of the previous period so that people had to start again, start from scratch, build up their institutions again, build up these periodicals and publishing houses. And this constant stop and start again, start from scratch is there throughout this history. I also wanted to highlight a history of censorship and silencing. So I've, as part of this kind of highlighting methodology that you can see in the text of the chapters, the red highlights are thematic highlights, and there I highlight censorship. It plays an important role in the silencing of Palestinian voices throughout this history. The issues of press freedom, and imposed media blackouts, this is not new. I mean, this also is mentioned in the text of the different chapters. The other things I highlighted and talked about was the targeting, killing, and assassinating of Palestinian cultural figures, including editors and journalists, and we are seeing this today with journalists. Also the persecution, harassment, imprisonment, administrative detention, forced exile, deportation, etc. Again, unfortunately, constant presence on in the Palestinian literary history. The destruction and looting of cultural organizations, universities, schools, libraries, archives, personal libraries, research centers is there throughout. And also this policy of imposing siege, isolating Palestinians from each other, fragmenting Palestinians from each other and from the rest of the world and from the rest of the Arab world. Again, policies that have been there throughout. I also paid attention and highlighted in red, so the thematic red, the massacres that occurred, because these also had an impact on Palestinian literary history in the sense that writers responded to these events. I didn't go as far as calling this theme genocide, because I would have never expected that such a thing would happen in the 21st century. But yeah, I highlighted that because that was also important in this history. And I just wanted to mention, maybe to end this answer with an example that I found so fascinating that, I mean, it was so early. I found a quote in a 1920 issue of Al-Watan newspaper. This is an Arabic language newspaper that was published in Santiago, Chile. And there was an article that described Palestinian periodicals. This was under the early British mandate, that these periodicals have water in their mouths. And this was in relation to the extensive censorship that was happening at the time. And it really resonated with me to read this quote now, because now I could say that Palestinian media, newspapers, etc. I can say that they have rubble in their mouths today.
It's fascinating. I want to start talking about the timeline. And I would like to cover the period between 1880 to 1950, the Magyar. The first period of developing transnational Palestinian diaspora, essentially. I was struck by the fact that you argue that most of the material produced is not public. And I was wondering if you can explain what that does mean. And also, can you paint for us a picture of the material available and how it defines Palestinian literature?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, these dates that I used for the timeline are rough dates. Let's say they demarcate certain beginnings, certain endings. So in this case, the 1880 to 1950, 1880 I used just because I read that the first recorded Palestinian presence in Chile was in the 1880s. And 1950 is also a rough date, but in the 1950s, a lot of Arabic language periodicals and publications in Latin America came to a sudden halt, especially in countries like Brazil, where there was new laws that prevented the publication in foreign languages and to promote publication in Portuguese, for example. But also there's the loss of the Arabic language. So these are the general demarcations. But let me just say that this Magyar period in general has never been included in Palestinian literary history. It's included in Arab literary history as a period of, let's say, the development of Romantic poetry. But actually, the way that it's done in Arabic literary history is focused much more on what is called the Northern Magyar, which is the US and Canada, let's say, more the US, versus the Southern Magyar, which is Latin America, Caribbean, Central America, etc., so South America. And there they just focus mainly on Gibran Khalil Gibran and Mikhail Nuaima and the names we already know. But very rarely is this period seen as actually quite strange. This is a period recognized as a period of Arab literary history, which takes place entirely outside the Arab world. I mean, no other period in the literary histories that have been written about Arabic literature take place outside the Arab world, except this one. But somehow this fact just gets brushed over. And I just became so interested in how is it possible that we have an entire period of Arabic literary history that takes place outside the Arab world. So this became for me the way to start this kind of literary history which moves between the homeland and exile and the diaspora. And in a way, this became the first transnational period of Palestinian literary history for me, which connected the local and the global in ways that I had never thought about before. So, and I would consider it the first period which features this transnational expansion of Palestinian literary geography to outside Palestine. And in this particular chapter, I focus on Chile, even though I did research in other countries, but Chile became the most important country to cover because of the large number. The Palestinian community is said to be the largest Palestinian diaspora community outside the Arab world. So Chile hosts that community. So that became extremely important to delve into more deeply. What the main source that I used to cover this period were periodicals. And as we are now in 2024, you can imagine that these periodicals are more than 100 years old. So in terms of sources, these are very, very fragile sources. And the fact that these Arabic language periodicals published in Latin America, and there's a map visualization in this chapter that shows just how many were published. It was an astounding number. I did not even realize that there was so many. And this is, we're just talking periodicals. I didn't trace publishing houses and other things. But because in our minds, the mahjar is usually the United States, the map shows that actually it's the southern mahjar that was the most productive in this period. And just in sheer numbers of periodicals being published in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, in Venezuela, and other countries. So yeah, one main source was the periodicals, but the periodical is a fragile source because it's old, but also because these were considered mainly community publications. So just something that the community published for itself, which didn't really warrant those host countries, let's say, to archive this material properly. And so you wouldn't necessarily find this material in national archives and national libraries. It was really difficult to find most of the titles that I was looking for across Latin America, for example. The other thing is that because they were community newspapers, they could potentially be found in non-conventional places, but I am yet to find them there. Honestly, I imagined that I could find them in people's private libraries and their private archives, in boxes of somebody's grandparents. Unfortunately, due to COVID, I couldn't do this kind of fieldwork that I wanted to do during the project, so it was not possible for me to access private archives. But I know from accessing other private archives that there is potential to find a lot of treasures there, but it was not possible at the time. So yeah, so the main source became these periodicals, the ones I could find. But another source, other sources I relied on were travelogues. For example, Akram Zuaitar wrote a travelogue of his time in mainly Latin America in 1947. I also relied on autobiographies, I relied on memoirs. So these were also sources used to fill some of the gaps. Really, whatever I could find to fill some of the gaps, I used. There's also books that listed the titles and dates of publications of periodicals, and sometimes their editors. We also use these sources. These are more like reference sources. But yeah, the sources had to be interdisciplinary, but they were also fragile and ephemeral.
I want to move back to Palestine after looking at the transnational dimension, of the project. And I want to ask about the period between the late Ottoman era and the British Mandate, which are by accident my historical periods, the periods that I work on. You call these times formative and foundational for Palestinian literary history. Can I ask you why?
Yes, this is another period that has been largely neglected in Palestinian literary history. This might be surprising for historians because I know historians work a lot on this period, but it hardly ever features in literary histories. I mean, I did locate some Arabic language sources that include this period in their literary history, but in English language sources, it is never included. So this period, as well as the Mahjar period, I call black hole periods, because these were periods I didn't personally know anything about, even though I was a scholar of Palestinian literature. But often we start Palestinian literature after 1948, but actually more accurately after 1967, because even the period between 1948 and 67, we often call the period of silence, or again, another period we don't know too much about. But coming back to this period of the British Mandate and diving into the sources of that period made me trace back so many aspects and the kind of main contours, the preoccupations and conditions of Palestinian literature to this period. And maybe I'll talk about 7 things that were really stood out for me. And again, I was coming to this period not knowing very much. I just knew the history after 1948. So it was coming to it retrospectively, but also trying to trace the seeds, let's say, that were planted during this period that had a great impact on Palestinian literary history. So the first one was the periodicals. And in another article I co-authored with one of my teammates in the project, Ibrahim Abdo, we called the article Adab Maqalat, or mentioned this phrase Adab Maqalat. So the role of periodicals becomes very important. So Adab Maqalat is the literature of articles, let's say, mainly that it's a literature published in periodicals versus being published in books. And this was a quote from Ishaq Musa al-Husseini in his attempts to describe the state of Palestinian literature during this period. So that really solidified the importance and the role of periodicals in Palestinian literary history during this period, but actually throughout the 20th century. So that was one thing, the role of the periodicals. The other one is just this connection between Palestinian literature and political events. Everybody asks about this. Why is this the case that Palestinian literature either is periodized according to political events, or, I mean, this is just an inevitable and important aspect of Palestinian literary history. So all the great upheavals and political turbulences of this period during the Mandate period, I mean, we have from the Nabi Musa, the 1920 Nabi Musa clashes, to the Buraq revolt in 1929, the Great Arab Revolt 1936 to 1939, World War II, etc. I mean, this is a period full of turmoil. And these events, I mean, in many ways, affected the lives and works of Palestinian literary figures and preoccupied their cultural and literary production. There was no way out of it. This really imposed itself on their work and their discussions and their debates. And in fact, I would say that 1936 to 1939 was the first real taste of the catastrophes to come in the wake of the Nakba, because there was a project to really annihilate all facets of Palestinian society, culture, literature, through the persecution, imprisonment, forced exile of the main cultural, literary, intellectual figures. And connected to all of these upheavals, political upheavals, comes the impact of censorship. So the impact of censorship was another aspect that I traced back to this period, which had an impact, or a huge impact, on the history of Palestinian literature. Related to that, prison as a tool of oppression that transformed writers into political prisoners and created a new literary geography, which is prison. This is something that I also trace back to this period. And in relation to prison, there's also important phrases, let's say, or terminology or themes that come out of this period that also are revived in later periods because of the continued prison experience. So Akram Zuaitar, for example, writes about a sijn Bayt al-Karama, that prison is the house of dignity. And he talks about political prisoners, these are writers, intellectuals, cultural figures, as al-Batal al-Fida'i, the militant hero, and the word Fida'i will be revived in later periods, as we know. So Akram Zuaitar really celebrated political prisoners as militant revolutionaries and politically engaged heroes. And this really set the tone for how these kinds of imprisonments, persecutions, harassments of literary, cultural, intellectual figures are viewed in the other later periods. Another important concept that comes out of this period in relation to prison is Emil Habibi. I'm not sure if I'm 100% sure that it is Emil Habibi that first comes up with this, but we did trace this in an article that he wrote during this period, where he goes to visit the prison in Akka, and he writes about السجن الصغير, the small prison, and السجن الكبير. So this idea of the big prison that Palestinians live in and the small prison being the prison itself, this will really continue throughout the different periods to be revived as a concept and something that people talk about, and we still talk about it today. We talk about Gaza as being one big prison. So this idea of the big prison, small prison also comes out of this period. And the fifth element would be the influence of concepts of anti-colonial resistance and revolution. And for me, and also for Ghassan Kanafani, and I will talk about this later also, that I think this gives rise to the idea of resistance literature in later periods, because this is the period where they start talking about the responsibility of the writer to be socially, politically, and culturally engaged. This is very much this early version of what we call iltizam, commitment, and resistance literature as coined and conceptualized by Ghassan Kanafani in the 1960s. And it's also not a coincidence that Ghassan Kanafani in a later publication comes back to this period to really trace the roots of resistance, very much to the Great Arab Revolt, to 1936 to 1939. A sixth element that really establishes itself here in this period, but becomes even bigger in later periods, is this element of the Palestinian diaspora. In this period, I talk about the Palestinian diaspora in the Mahjar, but this period will mark the beginning of this extended literary geography. So we realize we can't talk about Palestinian literature by just looking at Palestine. This is something that also comes up in relation to censorship, where we realize this, the fact that Palestinian writers, when there was periods of intense censorship, published elsewhere, and that periodicals in Chile, for example, were able to publish more than periodicals in Palestine about the situation in Palestine. So we realized that we have to have an understanding of Palestinian literature, you have to expand geographically, and this becomes very much the basis of this inside-outside dynamic. This is another theme I highlight in red throughout the chapters, that there is a kind of homeland diaspora continuum. So that really establishes itself when one looks at these black hole periods together, these Mahjar and Mandate periods. When you look at them together, they really establish the basis for this inside-outside dynamic. And the last thing I would say is that in this period, they talk about a literary nahda, so a literary renaissance that is taking place in Palestinian literature. But as with later periods, this nahda, this is often short-lived, stunted, stopped, suspended for all sorts of reasons, through all sorts of methods that I talked about, through censorship and imprisonment, etc. But this will come up in later periods where there are periods of a short-lived Palestinian literary renaissance, let's say, in Beirut, for example. But just as it was in the Mandate period, these are often stunted efforts that cannot continue, and people cannot really build on them.
You mentioned earlier the Nakba, so I guess we have to talk about 1948, the catastrophe, which divided Palestinians who became largely disconnected and living under different occupations. So perhaps while broadly discussing this period, could you focus on some of the characters that are discussed in the article? And I must say that I made a choice based on my sort of interest and certainly favorite individuals and work. So perhaps a few words about Emil Habibi, which you already mentioned, Mahmoud Darwish, and Hannah Nakara.
Mm-hmm. There's a timeline visualization which shows what happened to Palestinian literary figures after the Nakba. Where did they end up? This took a lot of research, actually, because I didn't personally know what happened to people. But this visualization really reflects the extent and scope of fragmentation, scattering, and dispossession of Palestinians after the Nakba, including Palestinian literary figures. So here in this period, the literary history is forced to take on a truly transnational character. I mean, this is not just a homeland diaspora continuum. This is where transnationalism really establishes itself on the scene. But what I wanted to do in this period is to, even though it's a period of rupture and discontinuity, I wanted to trace the continuities, even if they were negative, like censorship and prison and all of that. But the figures that you mentioned, I mean, I tried to trace history through figures. Of course, this was one way to do it, by following their trajectories, following their publications, following the debates, following their contributions that they made to periodicals specifically. And Emil Habibi is an interesting figure because he connects the Mandate period to this period, post-Nakba. So even in the Mandate period, Emil Habibi was a writer, journalist, and editor. He actually founded a magazine with his friends, Hannah Nakara, Najwa, Qawar Farah, and Hanna Abu Hanna. They established a short-lived but a satirical paper called Al-Mihmaz. At the time, Emil Habibi lived in Ramallah, as far as I understand. And then in 1948, he fled to Lebanon and made his way back to Haifa, a story that is fictionally represented in his famous novel, The Pest Optimist. So also, Emil Habibi becomes involved with the Communist Party and Al-Ittihad newspaper, which is the newspaper of the Communist Party. And it's there in the Mandate period that he writes this article about the big prison and small prison. So after the Nakba, there is a consolidation of the, let's say, importance culturally of the Communist Party inside Israel for Palestinians, because Al-Ittihad is one of the few or only periodicals to survive the Nakba and stay in Haifa. Others had to relocate. Literary magazines were completely shut down and came to a screeching halt, let's say. None of them continued. Some of the newspapers relocated from the coastal areas to Jerusalem and then maybe to Amman, but Al-Ittihad was the only one that continued in Haifa. And Habibi became much more involved in Al-Ittihad. He became the editor, but there he begins to write these satirical columns in the style of Al-Mihmaz, which he had already started pre-Nakba. And he writes under the pseudonym Juhayna. And also, Emil Habibi starts to publish his short stories in Al-Jadid, which is the literary supplement of Al-Ittihad newspaper. Some of the things I traced through Emil Habibi, let's say with the help of Emil Habibi, is again this prison, this preoccupation with prison and the presence of prison in the Palestinian literary and cultural scene. Again, Emil Habibi talks about this idea of the big prison, small prison. In the immediate aftermath of the Nakba, he actually talks about the ghettoization of Palestinians in Jaffa, He describes it as one big prison, and now we know that actually Palestinians were ghettoized in ghettos and barbed wired ghettos that were established in cities like Haifa, Jaffa, Akka, Lid, which imprisoned and segregated Palestinians from Jewish Israelis at the time. And here, in relation to prison, there's a lot of attention being paid on Mahmoud Darwish and his harassment, persecution, constant imprisonment or house arrest. Mahmoud Darwish really got a lot of attention and had extensive coverage in Al-Ittihad of his imprisonment and release. And Emil Habibi writes some of these articles that talk about this kind of a sense of crisis at the targeting and persecution of communist literary figures, including Darwish, who's being constantly arrested, and others like Samih al-Qasim, who also gets arrested and imprisoned, but he also gets suspended from his teaching job. This is another policy of persecution. And then you have people following in from Emil Habibi's kind of lead. You have people writing letters to Mahmoud Darwish in prison that are published in Al-Ittihad. And one is a poem written by Salim Jubran, and its dedication is to Mahmoud Darwish in the small prison. And another is written by Tawfiq Zayad, and he writes, in the lines of the poetry he dedicates to Mahmoud Darwish, he says, "My friend with the green eyes, from my big prison to you in your small prison." So this really becomes solidified through Emil Habibi and the publications in Al-Ittihad. One other thing, because I worked on Emil Habibi in my doctoral research, and I never quite understood his fascination with folk literature, Palestinian folk literature. This is another theme I highlight because this is something that is marginalized and sidelined when it comes to talking about Palestinian literature and why folk literature and that kind of folk literary heritage is so important to Palestinian literature. But we see Emil Habibi contributing to this effort, where he starts to write about the Arab literary heritage because of the isolation of Palestinians inside Israel. He writes about Al-Jahiz, and we know from his literary works that Al-Jahiz had a great influence on his literary work. And he also begins to write about folk literature and folk tales, so Palestinian folk tales. One thing I was really interested in tracing through Emil Habibi was this phenomenon of the Zionist Arabic language periodicals. So these were established by Zionist political parties to target and address what they called the Arab masses inside Israel, so the Palestinians. And Emil Habibi wages one attack after the other on these Zionist periodicals. So that's super interesting to read, because in some cases I couldn't access these periodicals, but it was nice to get an insight into exactly what the issues were with these periodicals. And Emil Habibi, I could trace those through Emil Habibi's writings during this period. Another thing about Emil Habibi is that he also begins to write about Kafr Qasim and the massacres that are taking place. This was also, there was also an imposed media blackout on what happened at Kafr Qasim. So this is interesting to see how Emil Habibi, as a journalist, was able to talk about or write about these things. I also trace Emil Habibi through other periods and his work, and in the period after 1967, which I call Israeli occupation, I see how Emil Habibi is being placed in this new genre of literature that they begin to speak about, which is called al-adab al-mahalli, or local literature. This is another theme I highlight in red throughout the different chapters, because I found this fascinating, that there's this genre that they are discussing. And then I tried to trace also his links to Palestinians in the 1967 areas, in the diaspora, and so forth. As for Mahmoud Darwish, I mean, Mahmoud Darwish is really integral to this project. He comes on the scene a bit later, obviously, than Emil Habibi, but he is one of these figures that I called connecting figures. He allowed me to connect so many things just through tracing his trajectory and his movements, his writings, his publications gave me so much insight into literary history and certain aspects of history that I didn't really know too much about. So in the period after 1948, Mahmoud Darwish is very much involved with Al-Ittihad and Al-Jadid. He's a member of the Communist Party. He also takes part in this phenomena, which I'm yet to find more sources on, but there's a phenomenon of poetry festivals that takes place. These are big poetry festivals that take place in Palestinian towns and villages inside Israel. And of course, in many cases, it leads to arrests, to shutting them down, etc. But these were extremely important arenas for these young poets to rise to prominence. And of course, Mahmoud Darwish contributed to these poetry festivals. And the way I found information about these festivals is when periodicals printed the poems that were recited in these festivals, and they often mentioned that this was recited at this poetry festival that took place in Nazareth, for example. And sometimes they would discuss these festivals and what happened as a consequence. So that was really important. Another thing about Mahmoud Darwish that I thought was really interesting but neglected often, because we know Mahmoud Darwish as the greatest poet, a great Arab poet, etc. But I would say Mahmoud Darwish probably has more prose writing than poetry. And he starts his career writing about Palestinian poetry in this period. After 1948, I found an early article of his in 1961 about the status of Arabic poetry inside Israel. So this is a kind of self-reflexive piece about what's going on in poetry. And Mahmoud Darwish also gives us access to this whole aspect of prison. So through his writings, he published poems that he wrote in prison in his famous collection, Ashiq min Filastin, a lover from Palestine. He also gives rise to this phenomenon of poet prisoners. People start talking about these poet prisoners, an entire generation of these poet prisoners. It's not just Mahmoud Darwish, but he's at the forefront of this phenomenon. And of course, people start to pay attention to this, especially Ghassan Kanafani, who, although there was very dire isolation at the time between Palestinians inside Israel and Palestinians elsewhere, Ghassan Kanafani, in his tireless and pioneering manner, always found a way around things. So he actually communicated with a friend in the United States who would send him clippings of whatever was published in Al-Ittihad, in Al-Jadid, about Mahmoud Darwish, about the other poets. And this gave rise to this idea of these resistance poets, the poetry of resistance or resistance literature.
Now, we will talk about resistant literature in a minute, but I want to ask about the post-Nakba era, which is also designed very well through the maps on the website, and you trace, how people moved. And so I wanted to ask about these Palestinian figures in the diaspora, which also obviously joined thousands of Palestinians that were already living abroad since the 19th century, as we saw earlier. So how did Palestinian literature develop in the post-Nakba era? What were the challenges faced?
There were so many challenges. This period is often called the period of silence, but it's actually not that silent when one starts to dig into the sources, especially the periodicals. What defines this period is that there is no Palestinian literary address to write to or write in or publish in. So Palestinian literary figures started writing more extensively in Arab periodicals, and they were dispersed across different locations. Mainly, I talk about Lebanon, Egypt, Kuwait, Iraq, and Syria. It was very difficult to track people in this period, just to figure out where they ended up, from Sudan to Canada to different places. But I think the main aspect of this period is the rise of Beirut. I mean, we will see this more in the later period, but Beirut becomes this hub of Arab cultural and literary activity in the 1960s. It's known for its openness, inclusivity. So all these Arab writers and poets and artists start to flock to Beirut, including a lot of exiled Arab writers from their own repressive Arab regimes. So in this way, Beirut becomes the perfect platform for what I later called the period after this, which I call the golden decade of Palestinian cultural production. But these dispersed and fragmented Palestinian cultural efforts don't really come together until Beirut in a collective sense, let's say. There's individual efforts here and there. People are publishing, people are writing, people are attempting to understand what happened, what is the Nakba, how can we write in light of the Nakba, what do we think of Palestinian literature, of being Palestinian. Another aspect of this period is institution building. So you see the creation of the Institute of Palestine Studies and the PLO Research Center. These become extremely vital institutions in the later period, which will attract and employ many important Palestinian literary figures. One person maybe I wanted to highlight is Samira Azam, because we, again, one of these neglected writers, even though people are paying more attention to her. But the reason I want to mention Samira Azam, because she writes in 1965, so this is a year before Kanafani publishes his work on resistance literature. She comes up with a different label, and she calls it Adab al-Ma'raka, so battle literature. She publishes her article in Al-Adab, which is where Kanafani will also publish his article, but she specifically asks what it means to write, what does it mean to write literature in the wake of the 1948 Nakba, and what is the role of literature during periods of ongoing battle, and how to write about the Nakba after the Nakba. These are serious questions that are being posed. And in parallel, there's a periodical in Jerusalem called Al-Ufuq al-Jadid, which is edited by Amin al-Shannar, and he starts to ask similar questions. He starts to, he wants to create a new genre called Nakba literature. So these efforts are happening in parallel. It seems that Samira Azam would have known about Shannar's efforts in Jerusalem, but the difference is that Azam placed the Nakba in this long shadow that she thinks it cast firmly within Arabic literature, and she just didn't confine it to just questions relating to Palestinian literature alone. In that way, she wanted to universalize the question of the Nakba and what it meant broadly for Arab and global literary issues. So she didn't see it as just a Palestinian question, whereas the efforts in Jerusalem were very much a Palestinian effort. But that's an interesting step by Azam to universalize this Palestinian condition, which, as we know now, many people in the world are living in these dispossessed, stateless, dispersed conditions. I know of Syrian writers and poets that have turned to Palestinian literature because of their newly exiled condition, and to try to understand how Palestinian literature and writers dealt with these difficult subjects. So this is what I wanted to highlight maybe about this period post-Nakba.
You already mentioned several times resistance literature. So between 1967 and 1982 is the period that you call a golden age in exile. And this is also the period when Ghassan Kanafani spoke about this idea, this concept of resistant literature.
So this is 1967, 1982. 1967 marks another exodus. So there's a multiplicity of expulsions that happen throughout Palestinian literary history. And here we have the Israeli occupation of the entirety of historic Palestine. So we have new waves of Palestinian refugees joining the diaspora. And this period has fragmentation and scattering at its highest levels. There is, I mean, if I consider the Nakba as the first exodus, the second being the Naksa of 1967, a third exodus during this period happens from Jordan in 1970, which is called the Black September. And then a fourth exodus marks the end of this period from Beirut, so in 1982. But in Beirut, let's go to Beirut because that was the context in which Kanafani published his work on resistance literature. So Beirut saw this brief moment, brief comparatively, of concentration, consolidation, and intensification of Palestinian literary and cultural production. So this was a coming together of sorts after intense periods of exile and fragmentation and dispossession. And in one of the podcast interviews, which is with Ghassan Zaqtan, he talks about Beirut at this time. So we asked him specifically about this. And he talks about how it brought together not just Palestinians, but other Arab literary figures that were fleeing the Nakba. And he talks about this area in Al-Hamra, which really was the heart, the beating heart of this Palestinian presence with its extended features in Beirut. So the Palestine Liberation Organization was the host of this show, let's say this cultural, intense cultural production, let's say a Nahda, another Nahda, or a Nahda in exile, as I write about it. So maybe we can think of it as a second Nahda, but a Nahda that doesn't happen in Palestine, that happens in exile. So here we have a proliferation of publications, periodicals, institutions, and here for the first time we find Palestinian-led efforts for cultural production. So not just Palestinians publishing in Arab outlets, but having their own. And of course, the Palestinian Revolution, which is known to have attracted so many people from around the world, including from Arab countries, was centered and consolidated in Beirut, and at the time became the most important liberationist and anti-colonial causes of the Third World. So this was a very important moment. And this is the moment that Ghassan Kanafani publishes the second iteration of his resistance literature, because let's remember the first one came out in 1966, which I assume Ghassan Kanafani, with all his pioneering vision, had been thinking about this well before this time. So he publishes this concept of resistance literature, and I would say the concept matched the mood, and that's why it took off. And other concepts didn't take off as much, like Samira Azam's concept and Amin al-Shannar's concept of Nakba literature didn't take off. In fact, they fizzled out, and resistance literature dominated the scene. It also became, for good or worse, it became the basis and the tool, and it became a measuring rod for the canonization of Palestinian literature. So maybe it exceeded the expectations of Ghassan Kanafani. And it attracted a lot of Arab attention, the fact that Ghassan Kanafani has discovered these unknown poet prisoners fighting for their lives, being harassed, persecuted, imprisoned, etc., inside Palestine, because most Arabs forgot that there were Palestinians still inside what became Israel, that were leading the way in terms of resistance. And this is quite ironic because the real, let's say, armed resistance was taking place in the diaspora. But Ghassan Kanafani shifted the lens to place it in Palestine, which was important for him, that resistance, direct resistance through writing, through literature, through these figures that were, whose voices are being silenced, were in Palestine. This was extremely important. They were not armed, they were not fida'is, but they were the heart of the resistance. So Kanafani, I would say, becomes really a very important figure. And it's not a coincidence that 6 out of the 10 people we interviewed for the podcast mentioned that Kanafani's literary output was the most important in the history of Palestinian literature. In particular, they mentioned this book on resistance literature. And in specific, his novella Men in the Sun, Rijal fi Shams. So these were the two that were pinpointed as the most important contributions to Palestinian literature that impacted the history. Also during this period is Kanafani publishing on the 1936-1939 revolt in Palestine. This is a very important publication and not many people pay attention to it. This was published in Shu'un Filastiniya, the periodical, Palestinian-led periodical established in this period. So that's also an important venue for Kanafani to write about these things. Another thing I wanted to highlight just quickly about this period is that it demarcates also a period where there is direct targeting through assassination of Palestinian literary figures. So there's a lot of violence, as well as, including the civil war, massacres, invasions and sieges. You have the assassination of Ghassan Kanafani himself in 1972, as well as the assassinations of Kamal Nasser and others. So Kamal Nasser was the editor of another periodical, Palestine Al-Thawra, and these people specifically who were working in journalism were targeted during these periods, both in Beirut and abroad. So I just mentioned the Beirut assassinations.
And talking about Beirut, the last period covered in your project in Country of Words is the period from 1982 to 1994, which mirrors what you call the collapse of a short period of centralizations, where all of the major figures basically were around Beirut. Events led literary figures, once again, to move across the Mediterranean region and beyond. Can you speak about this last period covered by Country of Words?
The exodus from Beirut marked the beginning of another yet extremely fragmented and scattered and compounded forms of exile. I mean, really, for me, this period looks like a glass breaking and the shards going everywhere. This also saw another exodus. This period saw another exodus from Kuwait in 1990 as a result of the Gulf War, another exodus. But Beirut really is the one that had the highly dispersed results. So after having this brief centralization, the shards fell across the Arab world, across Europe, Cyprus, and the Arab world from the Maghreb to the Mashriq. So again, it was difficult to trace what happened to people. I mean, the oral interviews really helped us to understand from people where exactly they went, because some people went briefly to Syria, then to Tunis. Some followed the PLO, went, especially the people who worked in press and media, who are also literary figures. They sought refuge in Yemen and then went to Tunis, and then tracing what happened to cultural organizations and periodicals. Many of them relocated from Beirut to Nicosia, not to Tunis, as the political cadres ended up in Tunis, but not necessarily the cultural organizations. And then one other location I focused on in this period is Paris, which stands out as an important literary hub in this period. And one figure that really helped me trace this period is Mahmoud Darwish, because somehow Mahmoud Darwish was present in all these places in different ways at once. So Mahmoud Darwish was said to relocate to Tunis. He lived in Paris, and he published his own periodical Al-Karmel in Nicosia, in Cyprus. So that covers it, I think, in just one figure and what happened to him and his trajectory. So in Tunis and other places, Palestinians had to start again, reestablish their institutions, unions, and periodicals, but it was all a semblance of what was there in Beirut. So only a skeletal version of what was in Beirut was established in these other places. Paris was interesting because it brought together actually the giants of Arabic literature at the time, these famous poets, Abdul Latif al-Lu'abi, the Syrian poet Adonis. They also brought their periodicals with them to Paris. It was also the site of a Palestinian cultural production, and Mahmoud Darwish there had a very close circle of friends around the Journal of Palestine Studies, the one that was published in French in Paris, edited by Ilyas Sanbar. So he became close to Ilyas Sanbar. Farouk Mardam Bey, who established Act Sud, that published a lot of, or translated Mahmoud Darwish's work into French and published it, and Subhi Hadidi, a Syrian literary critic. So he was very much exposed to a wider range of literary figures from the Mashriq and the Maghreb in Paris. He also contributed to a PLO-funded periodical called Al-Yawm Al-Sabi', which was very political, but actually gave Mahmoud Darwish a very wide platform across the Arab region. A lot of people read that periodical. And of course, he ran he was the editor-in-chief of Al-Karmel. So Al-Karmel became the most important Palestinian periodical in this period. And it's established itself as the Palestinian literary address. It was a transnational periodical. It reached Palestinians inside and outside. It also was at the heart of all the important debates that were going on in the Arab world.
I want to ask a question about Gaza. Gaza is a very hard place to research. Perhaps with the exceptions of few windows in the past 75 years, has always been a closed place. And nowadays is not only a closed place, but one that is subjected to massive destructions. And I was wondering if you can talk about your experience about researching literature produced in Gaza, and also if you can perhaps comment about the physical destructions and the destruction of heritage and literature, and how this may impact our understanding of Palestinian literature.
Gaza has to be one of the most difficult aspects of this project. Throughout the 20th century, Gaza was subjected to severe forms of destruction and devastation and censorship, to the point that it's so difficult to find any sources. We even worked with a local researcher, and I hope she is still alive today. And she had a very difficult time locating the sources that we, in theory, were after. We had collected titles of periodicals, names of people, but in the end, it was really the case that their national archives, libraries, etc., had undergone so much devastation and destruction, had to be built from scratch. I mean, really, Gaza epitomizes everything that has happened in Palestinian literary history, from censorship to imprisonment to sieges to destruction, in one place that has faced this over and over again. And I'm not just talking about the last 20 years, I'm talking about the entirety of the 20th century. And therefore, it became a very difficult place to find sources for various reasons in various periods. Mouin Bsesso being one figure that we tried to trace, just for him to give us some insights. I mean, he was a poet of resistance, and he was imprisoned both in Gaza and in Egypt. But again, it's this lack of sources that made it very challenging, and often one wants to forget Gaza because it's so difficult. And so, but we kept trying to put it on the map, because this project was, I was trying to cover all these periods. So every time we realized we have a gap for Gaza, we tried to find out why. And even if it was an explanation such as, censorship during the Egyptian rule period, meant that there wasn't that many periodicals being published, or that, for example, that Egyptian periodicals were cheaper than Palestinian periodicals, and therefore just money-wise, it wasn't feasible to publish so much in Gaza. Any aspect that we could find, even if it's to say that that's why we couldn't find the material. That's what we went after, just to at least highlight the difficulties in some cases of Gaza. In other cases, we did find copies of journals in the West Bank and other places in private libraries as well. But in most cases, some sources would have still existed in people's private libraries and archives, but I am not sure if anything is left now after the devastation and destruction and the targeting of universities, schools, libraries, archives. This is a history that's been, full of losses, full of traumas, full of silences, full of gaps. I really don't know what methods and tools we have in academia to address these very, very horrific and catastrophic man-made events that have led to such a situation in the 21st century.
This was Refqa Abu-Remaile, author of Country of Words, a Transnational Atlas for Palestinian Literature, published by Stanford University Press in 2023, and fully available at countryofwords.org. Refqa, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Roberto.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.